Alright guys, welcome back to another video in this Walnut Tea Cabinet series. So last video we did all the hand cut dovetails on the cabinet here. You can see it all together now. We're all ready to move on to our next stage, which is building the shelves. And so we have two different types of shelves in this cabinet. The bottom two shelves are going to be a frame and panel, or a frame design. We're not actually putting a panel on them, but it's the same principle. The top shelf is just a standard panel. Now our top shelf is going to be 1/4 of an inch thick, so I've got the first part of that glued up here. And just like I mentioned in the first video of this series, we did the top panel this way because it uses materials a little bit better. Again, because the whole case is built on a 2-to-1 ratio, or a somewhat 2-to-1 ratio. I can take the full length strips that would cut everything else here too, and then we're just going to cut this panel in half, flip around, glue it back up, and we'll have our final panel. All pretty much perfectly thicknessed and sized properly. Our other pieces are right here. You can still see they're rough off the bandsaw. They don't look it, but they are. And so they're sitting here just kind of ready to go. And so let's start by talking about the reason that we're going with a frame design for our bottom two shelves. The main reason for this is because we want everything to be as stable as possible. Because everything on this is made from real wood, we have to think about wood movement. And so not just the wood movement of the case, the shelving and all that itself, but of the drawers. And so wood does move quite a bit. Now again, we're working with fake quarter sawn panels, which makes it a heck of a lot easier to deal with, but it still is the thing we have to worry about. And so by doing that frame design on our bottom two shelves, we can make sure that those shelves are not going to dip in or cup upwards and pinch the drawers in. It's just a really good way to make sure of that. And the flip side of that is by leaving that gap in the middle, so not actually putting a panel in these, we can actually make sure that if the drawers do ever get stuck, we can get them unstuck fairly easily just by taking the drawer above it or the tray above it out and pushing the drawer out. It's a very easy, safe design to work with, and it's also just a little bit cheaper on materials. You're saving the materials that would have gone to fill in that center area if you just went with a standard panel. So it's all around just kind of an easier, cheaper, more functional option over just going with a standard panel like we are going with on the top. The reason we're going with the standard panel on the top is because, again, we don't really care about anything moving up there. If it moves a little bit after it's all glued together, it's not that big of a deal because there's nothing up there that is going to be a precise height that can't get kind of pinched or moved around if there's wood movement. So that's the different justification. And again, I don't know if I explained this at the beginning of the video. The way this is going to be laid out is there's going to be two drawers on the bottom, and then there's going to be a tray in the middle section that'll hold like a teapot or teacups, whatever you feel like storing in there, but it's something that you can have as a small serving tray or as just a way to keep things organized. Okay, so this part's actually pretty easy. There's nothing really that complicated about it, but you do want to make sure you take your time with your measurements and make sure that everything is as accurate as you can get it. And so our cabinet here is loosely assembled. Like you guys saw in the dovetail video, I actually have to apply a little bit of clamping pressure to really make everything seat up. So I know here that I'm building, just by having it the way it is, loosely put together, I'm actually adding in a little bit of variance there, and which is good because it means that it's going to be a little bit bigger, or my measurements are going to be a little bit wider. And so what you always want to do anytime you're doing this kind of stuff is you always want to measure, or take as accurate measurement as you can, but then add a little bit. We're talking like a 1/16th or 32nd of an inch. That way, if your measurements are just a little bit off, you're not screwing yourself over in the long run. And so the way I'm going to do this is I know I can find the interior of the case. So the interior of the case here is pretty much spot on 10 3/8 of an inch. Top to bottom were the exact same width, which is a really good sign. And then you're going to need a calculator. So 3 divided by 8 plus 10. I like to do it that way because I can never remember what the actual fraction, what the actual decimal is. And then I know that on either side, I'm going to have a 1/4 inch deep dado. So the dados that I'm going to be putting in are going to be 1/4 inch by 1/4 inch. You know, they're going to be nice square dados. And so all I need to do is add 1/2 inch to my length, and that gives me my cross length of 10 7/8. And then I'm actually just going to go into there and add a 1/16 of an inch, which is 10 15/16. So I don't want to round this up to 11 because adding 1/8 of an inch and then having to clean that 1/8 of an inch off is going to be just too much material to deal with. And because I know that I'm already cutting my dados to 1/4 inch deep, and I don't want these to actually be completely flush against that 1/4 inch deep, I'm going to want to take it a little bit extra. So it's all about building in these small amounts of extra material. That way you can always work to a better fit rather than having to try and make something that's too small fit. And so my pieces are all just under 25 inches long. So I know I can very easily get both of these pieces out of one length. But yeah, so we're going to 10 15/16 from that edge. And again, marking out your lines doesn't really matter because the first thing I'm going to do when I get over the table saw is I'm going to set up a stop. That is, you're just going to cut all these things to the exact same size. It's going to make it super easy for me. The reason I like to go through and mark out my lines is just as a double check. And if for some reason when I set up the stop or anything like that, I set it up off of my actual number that I want, it's just a very quick visual way to tell whether or not I'm going to actually cut on the line, pass the line, or just anywhere in between. That's not good. I want to make sure that I'm as accurate as possible with these. And so just putting a little quick line here, it takes all of 30 seconds and just can save you so drastically in the long run. So now for our front to back measurement, this is, again, it's fairly simple, but it comes with the understanding that I know that when in the final piece of this case, I'm going to want these shelves just offset slightly from the front. I think I'm going to go about 1/8 of an inch, just inset from the front edge, but I don't want to do that yet. It's easier to do that after everything's together because it's much easier to reference all this stuff properly when everything is the same size. So we're going to reference this from the inside of the rabbet to the front edge. So just measuring that. So our measurement there is 9 7/8, and we're just going to make sure you always want to check on multiple spots of the case. Again, because we know our pieces are going to be going on the bottom here, it's best to check it there, but it's also good to check everywhere else just to make sure, again, your cases and your panels are staying as flat and are even all that as possible. And for this one, I can cut pretty much exactly to that size of 9 7/8. I am going to add a 1/16 of an inch, so that's 9 15/16. I'm getting better at fractions, I promise. Okay, so with everything marked out now, we can go back over the table saw and start setting up our stops and get these pieces cut out. Alright, so I just swapped over to my FTG blade. Now again, this is not a proper FTG blade for joinery purposes. It's actually a all-purpose, or a heavy-duty ripping blade, which is what it's meant for. So it's going to leave a little bit more tear out, but again, because I've accounted for that little bit of extra tear out that we're going to get, I can just work around it. I can either hand plane it off or just cut it off with the table saw later on. It's not a problem. And so this is also the tenon jig I was talking about. So tenon jigs can come in all shapes and styles and fashions. You know, you can make ones that ride along your fence and all that. I probably would have built one of those if I had this table saw sooner, but I bought this when I was trying to make my DeWalt table saw be a little bit more precise and accurate, and it actually did help quite a bit. Now these tenoning jigs, I think this one was about $175, so they're not a cheap thing, but they definitely are very nice to use because they're such a precision and accurate thing. Everything on here is controlled with a little micro dial. And it's just a very nice way to work. It's also a very firm and secure way to mount your things rather than just kind of riding it along the fence of your table saw. So they're definitely a worthwhile investment, but they're not for everyone. And so our cross pieces, which is the ones going across the front of the case, are what we're going to have as our as the outside of the bridle joint. So we're actually going to be cutting a small groove down the middle of it. And so because these pieces are only 3/8 of an inch thick, and our blade is 1/8 of an inch thick, these are going to be really small bridle joints. And so the only way to get a perfectly centered bridle joint is by making 2 cuts. So I pass it through like that, I spin it around, pass it through like that, and then I get a perfectly centered joint in there. And so all I need to do to get this super accurately is just to take my marking gauge and measure into this piece. Now I'm going to set it up the proper way of actually referencing against a flat surface. And so I like using a marking gauge just because on my setup piece, because it just tells me a little bit more accurately compared to a pencil line or Sharpie line or chalk line, anything like that. And so you don't really have to make a super deep cut. You just want to make a cut across the grain on both edges. This will just give you something to set your blade height to. And because I know all my pieces, I cut them to the final width on the table saw. All these pieces are the exact same width. So on one of my front to back pieces, I'm just going to mark it across the grain on the face. And so this piece is what I'm going to use to actually set up my blade height. Rather than trying to set it up to this small line that I can't actually easily reference, I'm going to put this one in the jig and just set the blade up to that height because it's a little bit easier to tell the difference. Again, I don't care that much if I'm a little bit over or a little bit under. I want to be as close to that line as possible. But again, precision is not key here because we're going to be going in and cleaning everything up with hand tools later on before we actually fit it into the case. This is all fairly rudimentary joinery at this point in time. So having that fairly accurate line to measure to just makes the job a lot easier. And so the next thing I want to do is I want to get out my 1/8 of an inch setup block. I'm going to set my marking gauge to that 1/8 of an inch, just double check it. And even though I said that I'm not going to be able to get a perfectly 1/8 inch gap in here because my blade is more than 1/8 of an inch, I already know that, and I have to do 2 passes on it to get it centered, I'm going to use this just to mark out so that I know pretty much where to set my blade up to. So it's not going to make it very hard at all to make the cuts, but I know that I need to just center my blade between those 2 lines or be just over it, so I'm taking a very small amount off. Again, the nice thing here is that because I know that my outer pieces are actually going to be less than 1/8 of an inch, I only will have to do 1 pass on my front to back pieces, whereas if it was more than 1/8 of an inch, I'd have to do multiple passes and adjust the jig. But this is going to make my life a lot easier, and all it takes is just a little bit of setup. So we got both of the shelves out of the clamps, got them all cleaned up with the hand plane, as you guys saw there. So all I was doing with the hand plane there, just because I didn't feel like talking at that point in time, is I just cleaned up the edges on the shooting board, make sure that they're square all the way around, which they now are. And because anytime you're doing a bridal joint, they tend to separate a little bit on the outside of the joint, and so all I did was just lightly clean it up with my hand plane. They're still fairly rough because I didn't want to really go in and change any of the dimensions right now. I just wanted to clean up that little bit of expansion. We'll go through and sand them and clean them up all nicely before we actually glue them into the case. But now we have to actually cut the dados that those are going to be glued into. And so I've got this special jig that I built here, and it's just a track for my router, for my plunge router to ride in, and it's got a precisely half-inch groove in it. That's because I basically built the track to fit my router, then put my router in with a half-inch upcut spiral bit, plunge through, and cut all the way through to the end of this. It's a very simple jig to make. Really, it's just a bunch of straight pieces of MDF. You do have to make sure that they're square and straight, because that affects how square and straight your dados are going to end up being. But it's a really good way when you're dealing with panels like these small ones I'm dealing with right now to just put dados in and line them up. So when I know that when I'm laying out when I'm making my layout lines on my panels, I want to pretend that I'm dealing with half-inch dados. So even though I'm only dealing with 1/4 inch, I'm going to just add 1/8 of an inch on either side, which will then make them into a half-inch dado. That's much easier to lay out. Then all I have to do is line up the jig with the outside line, and I know that I'm going to be cutting exactly where I want to. The other important thing is to make sure I'm referencing the right end. So I always want to start my dados from the back edge, which in this case is easy because I have the rabbet on the back of these panels. I know where the backside is, but other times when I've done this and there isn't a rabbet back there, you really want to just, whatever you can do, whether it's putting a white chalk mark on the back, you draw with Sharpie on the inside, you just scribble on the back end with pencil, whatever it is, you want to make sure you know which is the backside, because unless you have a rabbet like this, it becomes really easy to mess up. And if you make a dado in from the front, well, that just kind of sucks and ruins your whole day. And so this is where having really detailed plans come in handy. So I know that from the bottom of the panel, for the bottom of the cabinet up to my first bottom shelf is 3 3/8. Yes. No, 5/8. I'm trying to convert decimals to fractions in my head. It's not easy. But I know it's 3 5/8 from the bottom of the panel. So all I have to do to get my accurate measurement on my panels is take that 3 5/8 measurement, add the width of my dovetails here, and then I can just measure in from there. So the only trick here again is going to be doing that little bit of addition. And so our dovetails I already know are fairly accurate at being the thickness of our panels, which is right about 5/8. And then we added that 1/16 of an inch, so they're 5/8 plus a 1/16. And again, this doesn't have to be super accurate, but it has to be consistent. So one of my favorite mantras within woodworking and fine woodworking especially is accuracy doesn't matter nearly as much as consistency. If you make the exact same cut 10 times and it's all technically wrong, but it's the exact same length, it's the exact same spot, it's exactly where you technically need it to be, that's way better than having every single cut precisely at 10 inches or something like that. So now we've got our bottoms over here, our top is on this side, it's all super easy to go and lay out. And so I'm just going to go through and make some marks here on this next point where I'm just going to take a perfectly 90-degree square. I want to make sure that I'm measuring off the front edge. That way, because again, I don't have a guarantee that rabbet, it should definitely be completely square. But again, there's some human error in just how I held the panel there if I twisted it all. Whereas I know that the front edges, there's no chance of twisting that panel weirdly when you're making a through cut with the blade. It's just not really possible. So it's way more accurate of an edge compared to the rabbet. Again, I could measure off the rabbet. In fact, I can actually pretty easily check my rabbets before I insult them too much. Yeah, so our rabbet is actually perfectly square. It lines up, everything lines up perfectly, and I can actually get a line all the way across, which is even better. And so this doesn't need to be perfect because there's a lot of ways just by using hand tools and what we're going to be doing later on that we'll be able to go through and do micro adjustments. But you want to make sure that you're within a 1/16 to a 32nd of an inch of where you want to be. That's the important thing, because yeah, we can do some minor adjustments, but nothing, we can't fix the shelves by 1/4 of an inch. It's just not really feasible and not really practical to do. So I think these are going to be pretty good. Actually, I know they're going to be pretty good. And so we're just going to go through and lay out the rest of the cutting lines. Alright, so that does it for probably the most stressful part of this project. So I know you guys can't really tell it on the camera here, but our top one and our bottom one are pretty much perfect. They're almost spot on with each other. There might be a little bit of variance, but nothing super noticeable. Our middle one is where we have a pretty big problem that's going to be kind of interesting to solve. I know how to solve it, so I'm not too worried about it, but it's going to be kind of a pain in the butt, because they're just a little bit off each other. I would say just about a 1/16 of an inch off. They're out of alignment. So this could have been I bumped the jig, or I just put the router in wrong, something like that. Literally anything could happen that could cause that, but it's nothing that I'm going to freak out too much about. And so the way we're going to actually solve that problem, and we'll cover it in the next video when we actually get around to doing it, is just cutting, because we're putting a rabbet on either one of the edges of these shelves, all we have to do is just change the depth of the rabbet on either side to work our piece into the proper squared up position. So it's going to take something, it's going to take a little more concentration, a little more patience, but it is definitely doable. And so in the next video, we're actually going to start doing the glue up of the case, because we can't start fitting the shelves until the case is actually together. We're also going to start doing a little bit of finish on the inside of this, as well as on the shelves. That way just glue won't stick to the parts that I don't want it to stick to. So that's all going to be in the next video, coming out very soon here. And yeah, so I do hope you guys enjoyed this one, and I will see you in the next one.